She survived his fists, his lies, and his manipulation, but when the final battle came, could Emily protect her son, and herself, from the man who was determined to destroy their future? This is the story of a mother's fight for freedom, a journey filled with pain, betrayal, and an unbreakable bond of love that no one could shatter. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. The night had fallen heavy over the small town of Ashford. The storm outside beat against the windows with an unforgiving fury, mirroring the chaos inside Emily's house. She sat on the worn-out couch, hugging her knees to her chest, her heart racing in her chest. Every creak of the floorboards above sent shivers down her spine. Alex, her husband, was home. And that alone was enough to set her nerves on edge. Alex had never been this way before. She remembered a time when he was gentle, kind even. But over the years, something had changed. The man she had married had slowly faded, replaced by someone darker, consumed by his vices. The drinking, the anger, the unpredictability. Emily had learned to live with it, or so she thought. But tonight, something felt different. He had been gone for days, out on one of his benders, and she had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would return sober, willing to make amends. But as she heard the familiar sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the hope drained from her. She could feel it in the air, the tension, the anticipation of what was to come. "Emily," Alex's voice called from the doorway, rough and slurred. "Where are you?" She stayed quiet, afraid that even the softest sound would set him off. Her 3 dogs, Shadow, Pearl, and Rust, were lying in front of her, eyes wide, sensing the danger. They had always been there, her loyal companions. In this world of shadows, they were the only things she trusted. Alex stumbled into the living room, his eyes wild and unfocused. "I said, where are you?" He swayed slightly, his breath reeking of alcohol. Emily slowly stood up, her heart pounding. She could feel her pulse in her throat, each beat like a drum. "Alex, please, you're drunk. We don't need to do this tonight." He stopped in his tracks, glaring at her as though he hadn't heard a word. "Don't talk back to me, woman," he spat, his voice low but filled with venom. "You think you can just hide from me?" Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to defuse the situation. She knew better than to provoke him. But as his eyes darkened, and his hands clenched into fists, she realized that nothing would stop him now. "Emily, you've ruined everything." His voice cracked with fury. "You think you're better than me? Huh?" The dogs sprang to their feet, instinctively stepping between Emily and Alex, their hackles raised. Shadow, the large black German shepherd, growled low, warning Alex to stay back. Pearl, the delicate white husky, stood poised, her eyes fixed on Alex, while Rust, the brown terrier, barked furiously, though small and harmless. "Enough," Alex hissed, swiping at the air as though trying to dismiss them. "Get out of my way, you filthy animals." Emily's breath caught in her throat as Alex stepped forward, his arm reaching toward her. She could feel the cold sweat on the back of her neck, her body frozen in fear. This wasn't the man she married. This was someone else, someone she didn't recognize. In that moment, Emily made a choice. She wasn't going to wait for him to strike first. The police were already on their way, alerted by a neighbor who had heard the shouting. As if on cue, the door burst open. 2 officers entered, their presence like a shield between Emily and Alex. Before Alex could react, they subdued him, his drunken struggles meaningless against their trained strength. "Get off me," he shouted, but it was too late. Emily watched, her heart pounding, as Alex was led out of their house in handcuffs. The relief was overwhelming, but it didn't last. As soon as the door closed behind the officers, the silence was deafening. She was alone. Alone with her thoughts. alone with her fears. Her 3 dogs, sensing the danger had passed, quietly returned to her side. Shadow nuzzled her gently, Pearl lay down at her feet, and Rust curled up next to her, their warmth comforting her as the storm outside raged on. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was over, but she knew the hard part was just beginning. The days after Alex's arrest were a blur for Emily. She spent hours staring at the walls of their home, now empty and cold, as if it had become just another reminder of her captivity. There was a strange sense of emptiness that settled over her, a vacuum where love and memories once lived. But there was also something else. Something unfamiliar. It was freedom. Emily hadn't known what true freedom felt like in years. Her life had been defined by Alex's moods and needs, his demands and his unpredictable violence. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she had space to breathe. It was a strange, almost suffocating feeling, the silence of the house too loud without the constant hum of his anger and resentment. She wasn't sure what to do with herself, what to do with the space he had left behind. Her first priority, however, was clear. She had to care for her son, Tommy. The 7-year-old boy had been caught in the middle of their turmoil, his innocent eyes seeing things a child should never have to witness. Alex's anger had always been unpredictable, and Tommy had learned to keep his distance. But now, it was just the 2 of them, and Emily was determined to make this a new beginning for him, away from the violence, away from the fear. Her first step was finding work. The next morning, after a restless night, Emily put on the only pair of clean clothes she had, old jeans and a faded t-shirt, and walked down to the local diner. She had no experience beyond being a mother and wife, but she had to start somewhere. As soon as she stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and greasy bacon filled her senses, oddly comforting. The owner, a middle-aged woman with dark circles under her eyes and an ever-present smile, greeted her with a nod. "Can I help you?" "I need a job," Emily said quietly, avoiding the woman's gaze. "Anything. I can clean, I can serve, I can cook." The woman looked at her for a moment, sizing her up, before nodding again. "We need a waitress. You can start today, if you want." Emily felt a rush of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." The job wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, long hours on her feet, serving customers who barely looked at her, busy with their own lives, their own troubles. But every day, Emily worked harder, kept her head down, and pushed through. The tips weren't much, but they were enough to start rebuilding her life. Slowly, piece by piece, she could see the foundation of something new beginning to form. But it wasn't just the work that kept her going, it was the dogs. Shadow, Pearl, and Rust had been her constant companions since Alex was taken away. No matter how late she came home, they were there, waiting for her. Rust would always bark first, jumping up and down as if he hadn't seen her in years. Pearl would wag her tail, gracefully hopping towards her. And Shadow, always the calm and protective one, would sit by her side, as though silently saying, "We're here for you." She needed them more than she realized. They had become her lifeline in a world that no longer felt familiar. One evening, as she walked home from the diner, exhausted from a long shift, she was startled by a loud bark from behind her. "Shadow? Pearl? Rust?" she called, turning quickly, expecting to see them running toward her, but the street was empty. The night was cold, the air thick with mist. She could feel her heart racing again, the panic creeping in. She had always felt safe knowing they were just a few steps behind her. But tonight, the silence felt different. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't until she reached her front door that she saw them. Shadow, Pearl, and Rust stood in the yard, staring at her. But something was off. They weren't wagging their tails, weren't rushing toward her in excitement. Instead, they stood stock still, their eyes fixed on something in the distance, their bodies tense. Emily froze. Then, from the darkness, she saw a figure approach, the unmistakable silhouette of a man. Her heart skipped a beat. Alex. He had escaped. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the cold air biting her skin as she stared at the figure slowly approaching from the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she thought she might be imagining it, her mind playing tricks on her after the long, exhausting days of work and fear. But then the figure stepped forward, the outline of a man becoming clearer in the dim light. It was Alex. He looked different, but still unmistakable. His face was thinner, hollowed out from his time in jail, his eyes bloodshot and wild. His clothes were ragged, like he had just escaped from the clutches of a nightmare. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator creeping toward its prey. For a moment, Emily froze, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told her to run, to lock the door, to hide. But then she remembered the dogs. Shadow, Pearl, and Rust hadn't moved an inch, standing as if they were waiting for her command. Shadow's muscles were taut, his eyes never leaving Alex. Pearl's fur stood on end, her ears perked. And Rust, the small terrier, was growling low in his throat, the sound more menacing than his small size suggested. It was then that Emily realized what they were doing, they were protecting her. Emily. Alex's voice was low, rough, almost pleading. Please. I just need to talk to you. The words hit her like a slap in the face. It had been weeks since the night of his arrest, and yet here he was, standing on her doorstep like nothing had changed. As if the terror he had put her through meant nothing. The rage, the fear, the physical and emotional scars, none of it had been enough to make him see the monster he had become. What do you want, Alex? Emily's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. He took another step closer, and her heart clenched. I've been through hell, Emily. I've changed. I swear. Please, just hear me out. But she saw the same man standing before her that she had seen so many times before, empty, desperate, and full of lies. His eyes darted to the dogs, noticing for the first time how they were positioned in front of her. Get those damn mutts out of my way, he growled, his voice suddenly dripping with venom. Shadow growled in response, a deep, rumbling sound that sent chills down Emily's spine. Pearl bared her teeth, her posture defensive. Rust continued to growl, his small body vibrating with energy. Alex took another step, and that was when Emily knew, he wasn't here to apologize. He wasn't here to beg. He was here to take control again. He had always believed he could, that he could make her feel small, insignificant. But not anymore. Alex, Emily said firmly, taking a step back and positioning herself so the dogs stood between them. You need to leave. Right now. His face twisted in anger. You think you can just throw me away? After everything I've done for you? For that brat you call a son? The insult hit her like a knife to the gut, but Emily stood tall. The months of pain, fear, and silence had given her a strength she didn't know she had. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, rising up like a tide, ready to push back against everything Alex had done to her. You don't get to talk about my son, she said, her voice cold. And you don't get to come here and think you have a right to anything anymore. You lost that the moment you put your hands on me. Alex's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Emily thought he might lunge at her, that he might try to overpower her like he had so many times before. But she wasn't that frightened woman anymore. She had fought for her life, for her freedom. She wasn't backing down. Get out, she repeated, louder now, as the dogs growled more fiercely, their eyes locked on Alex. Something in Alex's expression faltered. For the briefest of moments, it looked like he was going to argue, to push back. But then he hesitated, his anger bubbling just below the surface. Emily could see the indecision in his eyes, the internal battle he was fighting. For the first time in a long while, he didn't seem so certain of himself. "Fine," he spat, his voice thick with rage and humiliation. "But this isn't over, Emily. I'll be back. You can't just erase me from your life." He turned and staggered back into the darkness, his footsteps echoing in the still night air. Emily stood there, her heart still racing, her entire body tense as if waiting for him to reappear. But he didn't. Slowly, she turned back to the dogs. Shadow's calm gaze met hers, Pearl's tail gave a tentative wag, and Rust trotted over to her, nuzzling her leg affectionately. "You did it," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You protected me." She sank to her knees, tears welling in her eyes. Not just out of fear, but out of something deeper, something she hadn't felt in a long time, gratitude. The dogs, her silent heroes, had saved her again. And in that moment, she realized that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. She had the strength to keep going. She had the courage to fight for herself and her son. And no matter what Alex tried to do, she would never go back to that life. Not ever. The following days were a blur of cautious steps and silent decisions. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Alex wasn't done with her, no matter how many times he swore he would never come back. She knew better now. He would always return when he thought she was weak, when he thought she was afraid. But this time, something had changed. Something in her had shifted. The woman who once lived in constant fear was no more. She wasn't going to let him take that from her again. But even with her newfound resolve, Emily couldn't ignore the gnawing uncertainty that kept her up at night. The fear wasn't gone, it had simply changed shape. It was no longer about being physically trapped in her own home, now, it was the constant worry that Alex would try to force his way back into her life, back into their son's life. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't allow that. That evening, after another exhausting day at the diner, Emily sat down on the couch in the quiet of her apartment. Tommy was already asleep in his room, his small frame curled up under the blanket, completely unaware of the turmoil that had consumed their lives. She gazed at the pictures on the walls, the family photos from a time before the violence, before the rage, before everything had fallen apart. They were a reminder of what once was, and yet she felt no nostalgia for them. Only pain. The dogs were scattered around the living room, each of them silently keeping watch, as they always did. Rust was curled up at her feet, Pearl was lying beside Tommy's door, and Shadow was pacing the perimeter of the room, his eyes never straying too far from the window. Emily felt her throat tighten as she thought of Alex again. She had hoped, prayed even, that she would never have to see him again. That he would stay in jail where he belonged. But when he had shown up at her doorstep, every fear she had pushed aside came rushing back. His voice, his words, the way he tried to manipulate her into believing that he could change, she knew better than to fall for it. Still, a part of her hesitated. The part of her that had once loved him. The part that had believed in the man she married, the man she thought she would grow old with. What if he really had changed? What if he was different now? No, Emily thought, shaking her head. You can't go back. Not for him. Not for anyone. She had already made her decision. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about thriving. For Tommy. For herself. She could never go back to the life she had with Alex, no matter how many promises he made. It was time to make the hard choice, to sever the final ties, to end the story once and for all. The next morning, Emily walked into the small office of a family lawyer she had contacted the day before. The office was cold and sterile, filled with bookshelves lined with law books, and a single potted plant in the corner. She felt out of place there, but she couldn't afford to second-guess herself anymore. This was the only way forward. "Ms. Carter?" The lawyer's voice was gentle as he gestured for her to take a seat. He was an older man, his glasses perched at the end of his nose, his hands steepled together. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to file for divorce," Emily said, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of resolve. "And I want to make sure Alex can't come near me or my son again." The lawyer nodded, his expression serious. "We'll take care of everything for you, Ms. Carter. But I have to warn you, it might not be easy. Your husband may fight you on this." "I'm not afraid of him anymore," Emily replied, her voice firmer than she had expected. "I'm not afraid of anything." As the lawyer took her through the paperwork, Emily signed everything without hesitation, her hand steady on the pen. When she was done, she realized how much weight had been lifted off her shoulders. This wasn't just a legal decision, it was the beginning of her freedom. She wasn't just leaving Alex behind, she was leaving behind the fear, the shame, and the guilt that had followed her for so long. But as Emily left the lawyer's office, a new concern emerged. She knew that Alex wouldn't take this lying down. He would come after her. He always had. She had to be ready for whatever came next. When she returned home, she found Tommy in the living room, his face lit up with a smile as he ran over to her. "Mom, look," he said excitedly, holding up a small drawing of a dog. "I made this for Shadow. Do you think he'll like it?" Emily smiled and knelt down to take the drawing from him. It was a simple picture, just a rough outline of a dog with big ears, a wagging tail, and a smile on its face. But it was perfect. Tommy's innocence, his joy in the little things, made her heart ache. She wanted to protect him from the world. From everything. "Shadow will love it," Emily said, giving Tommy a big hug. "And you know what else? You're going to a new school next week. A better one. Where you can make new friends. Where you can feel safe." Tommy looked up at her, his eyes bright with excitement. "Really, Mom? I get to go to a new school?" Emily nodded, brushing a tear from her eye. "Yes, baby. A new start for both of us." And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt the hope she had been searching for. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. And she was ready for it. The days following Emily's decision to file for divorce were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. On one hand, there was a sense of relief. Finally, she was taking control of her life. Finally, she was walking away from the past that had held her captive for so long. But on the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alex wouldn't let her go so easily. He never had before. He was the kind of man who refused to accept defeat, who believed that everything in his life was his to control, including her. As much as Emily wanted to believe he was gone for good, deep down, she knew better. The battle was just beginning. The first few weeks after filing the papers were quiet. Too quiet. Emily kept her guard up, always watching the shadows, always listening for the sound of footsteps that weren't hers or the dog's. Shadow, Pearl, and Rust remained vigilant, their every movement in sync with hers, as though they knew the danger wasn't over. They had become her family, her protectors in a world that still felt foreign and dangerous. Tommy had started his new school, a small private institution just a few miles away from their apartment. It wasn't the most luxurious, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. Every morning, Emily walked him there, holding his hand tightly as they passed through the gates. There was a new brightness in Tommy's eyes now, a spark of excitement that hadn't been there in months. He was making friends, enjoying school again, his laughter filling the apartment in the evenings. But Emily's own nights were restless. She couldn't sleep without wondering when Alex would show up again, what he might do next. She kept the doors locked, the blinds drawn, and spent her evenings in a constant state of alertness. She hadn't heard from him since that night he had confronted her at the door, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he found a way to break through her walls. One night, nearly a month after the incident, Emily sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, trying to settle her mind. The house was quiet, too quiet. Tommy was with a friend for a sleepover, and the dogs were curled up by the door, watching the night outside. There was no sound except the occasional creak of the floorboards, the house settling in the cool air of the evening. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Emily's heart skipped a beat, the blood draining from her face. She froze, holding her breath. Not tonight. Not now. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, every nerve in her body alert. She glanced over at the dogs. They were up now, their eyes fixed on the door, their bodies tense. Shadow's low growl vibrated through the air. Pearl was standing, tail raised, and Rust was on his feet, pacing back and forth as if preparing for battle. Emily's hand hovered over the door handle. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend she didn't hear. But another part of her knew that whatever was waiting outside that door, she couldn't hide from it anymore. She opened the door slowly, just enough to peer out, and there he was, Alex. For a moment, she felt paralyzed. He was standing there, his face grim, his eyes bloodshot and empty, the same man she had tried so desperately to escape. But something was different about him now. He wasn't angry, not the way he had been before. There was something quieter, more calculated in his demeanor. The anger was still there, but it was buried beneath a facade of calm. "Emily," he said, his voice almost too calm. "We need to talk." Her instincts screamed at her to close the door, to lock it, to never let him in. But she didn't. She stood there, her body rigid, her mind racing. She couldn't let him back in, not into her life, not into their son's life. But something in the way he looked at her, the way he didn't seem to want to shout, to throw her down on the ground and remind her of the power he once had over her, made her hesitate. "I told you to leave, Alex," Emily replied, her voice steady, but the knot in her stomach was tighter than ever. "We're done. There's nothing to talk about." His expression softened, just slightly, as if he was trying to appeal to some part of her that still cared, that still remembered the man he had once been. "Emily, please. You don't understand. I've been through therapy. I'm trying to get better. I've stopped drinking. I've stopped everything." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man standing in front of her could actually change, could become the person she had once known. But the truth was, she couldn't trust him. She couldn't go back to that life, to the lies, to the terror that had nearly consumed her. "No, Alex. This is over. I'm not the woman I was. And you're not the man I married," Emily said, her voice hardening. "I'm done." For a moment, he stood there, his face unreadable, as though he were processing her words. The air between them was thick with tension. And then, in a flash, everything changed. Alex stepped forward, his hand reaching for her, but Shadow was faster. The massive German shepherd lunged forward, his teeth bared, growling fiercely. Pearl and Rust were on their feet, snarling, ready to defend. "Stay back!" Emily shouted, her voice trembling but firm. She stepped in front of the dogs, holding her hand out, her eyes locked on Alex. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Alex." "Not anymore," she said, her words sharp, filled with the strength she hadn't known she possessed. He stopped in his tracks, looking at her as if he'd just seen her for the first time. Slowly, he lowered his hand, his face hardening into a mask of anger and frustration. "You'll regret this, Emily," he hissed, his voice laced with venom. "You'll regret pushing me away." Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. With a final look, Alex turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Her hands were shaking as she closed the door, locking it behind her. The dogs returned to their spots, lying down as if nothing had happened, but Emily could feel the weight of what had just occurred. She had won. She had stood her ground. And she wasn't going to let Alex, or anyone, take that away from her again. The night after Alex's visit, Emily couldn't sleep. Her body was exhausted, her muscles aching from the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins during the brief encounter. She had locked the door, double-checked the windows, and still, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. The dogs were quiet, their usual vigilant stances relaxed now that the threat had passed. But Emily's anxiety refused to settle. Alex's words, his chilling promise to return, echoed in her mind. She had done what she needed to do, stood firm when she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all, but a lingering doubt began to creep in, one she had tried to suppress for weeks. Was she really safe? Could she keep Tommy, keep herself, truly safe? Or had she only delayed the inevitable? The dog seemed to sense her unrest, even if she couldn't quite put it into words. Shadow lay beside her bed, his large body stretched out protectively at the foot, while Pearl slept at the foot of Tommy's door, as always, guarding her son. Rust curled up on the couch, his small form nestled into the cushions, yet even he seemed to be on high alert. Emily ran her hands through her hair, trying to calm herself, but all she could see were Alex's eyes, those wild, unpredictable eyes that had once been full of affection, now full of menace. He had changed, yes. But had she? The next morning, after another restless night, Emily woke early, as she had every day, to prepare breakfast for Tommy. He would be excited to go back to school, to show off his new drawing of Shadow that he had made the night before. But Emily was different now, her heart heavy with a burden she hadn't fully understood before. The truth she had kept buried beneath layers of hope and denial had surfaced, and it was undeniable. She hadn't just been a victim to Alex's violence, there was something darker at play here. As she prepared the pancakes, the familiar scent of cinnamon filling the kitchen, her phone buzzed from across the room. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the message. It was from the lawyer. "Emily, we need to discuss a development regarding your case. Please call me as soon as possible." Her stomach sank. What now? She wondered. She had hoped that after filing the divorce, after taking the steps to protect herself and Tommy, there wouldn't be anything more to deal with. But she had learned long ago that nothing was ever that simple. Tommy walked into the kitchen, his messy hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes bright and full of excitement. "Morning, Mom," he said, sitting down at the table, his backpack still hanging from his shoulder. "Are you going to pick me up from school today?" "Of course," Emily said, trying to smile, but her mind was already elsewhere. "I'll be there." After a quick breakfast, she kissed Tommy goodbye, watched him walk to school, and then called her lawyer. The conversation that followed was something Emily had feared, though she didn't fully realize the implications until the words were out in the open. "Emily," the lawyer began, his voice grave. "It seems Alex has hired a lawyer of his own. And he's trying to contest the divorce on the grounds of mental instability." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "He's lying, right?" "I'm afraid not," the lawyer replied. "He's claiming that he was never in his right mind, that his actions were due to severe mental illness, and that he's been undergoing treatment. He's trying to say that he should have more access to Tommy and you, as he's been rehabilitated." The words hit Emily like a slap in the face. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur of disbelief and anger. Mental instability? This was the man who had abused her for years, who had terrorized her, and now he was using it as an excuse for his actions? To regain control of her life? "I'm sorry, Emily," the lawyer continued. "But with the right documents, with proof from his treatment and mental health professionals, there's a chance he could get partial custody. This is going to be a long fight. He's determined, and he's not backing down." Emily's stomach twisted. It felt like the floor had dropped from beneath her. The weight of the truth she had known, the truth she had tried to deny, was suddenly crushing her. Alex wasn't going to disappear. He wasn't going to quietly fade away. He was going to fight her with everything he had, and this time, it wasn't just about her safety, it was about Tommy's. For the first time since that night, Emily felt the fear she had been running from. But it was different now. She wasn't the woman she had been when Alex first left. She was stronger, more focused. And she had learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about taking back control. The lawyer's voice broke through her thoughts. "I'll need you to gather any evidence you have, medical records, police reports, anything that can help prove the pattern of abuse. We need to prepare for a fight." "I'll do whatever it takes," Emily replied, her voice steady, but her heart pounding in her chest. "I'll fight for Tommy. I'll fight for both of us." The call ended, and Emily sat in silence for a long time, her mind reeling. She had come so far, had built a life she was starting to feel secure in again. But now, it was all threatened by a man who had never once considered the damage he had done. But then, something shifted inside her. She could feel it in her bones, this was her fight. And this time, Alex wouldn't win. The dogs were at her side again, sensing her tension, but this time Emily didn't feel afraid. She felt something else, something stronger. She had fought for herself before. And she would do it again, this time, with everything she had. The days that followed were a blur of emotions and decisions that seemed to come faster than Emily could process them. Her mind was consumed by the thought of the upcoming legal battle with Alex. The fight for her son's safety was only just beginning, and the reality of what lay ahead hit her harder than she could have anticipated. She knew Alex was ruthless, but now she saw just how far he was willing to go. He would use anything, everything, to tear their lives apart again. But Emily was done running. Every morning, she would sit at the kitchen table, sorting through the paperwork her lawyer had requested. Medical records, old police reports, text messages, and photographs, all pieces of evidence that painted the full picture of Alex's abusive behavior. Emily had kept everything. Every bruise, every scream, every broken promise. They were her armor now, her shield against the lies Alex was spreading about his rehabilitation. He could not rewrite the past, no matter how hard he tried. As the weeks passed, Emily's resolve only strengthened. She found herself no longer looking over her shoulder in fear, but instead, facing the future with purpose. The truth was on her side. The law was on her side. And most importantly, she had Tommy. Her love for him was the fuel that kept her going, even on the hardest days. The battle was slow and grueling. Alex's lawyer used every tactic they could to discredit Emily, to twist the narrative, to make her appear unstable, paranoid, and unreasonable. They attacked her character, tried to paint her as an unfit mother, all in a desperate attempt to shift the focus away from Alex's own history of violence. But Emily had anticipated it. She had prepared for this. The courtroom was where the truth would come to light. On the day of the final hearing, Emily felt a strange sense of calm. She had spent so many nights replaying the scenarios in her mind, thinking of what Alex might say, how he might try to manipulate the situation. But now, sitting in that cold, sterile courtroom, she knew there was only one person who could speak for her, and that was herself. As the trial progressed, Alex took the stand, his demeanor calm, controlled. He spoke about his rehabilitation, his treatment, and how he had found God during his time in prison. He claimed that he was no longer the man who had abused Emily, that he had changed, and that he was now ready to be a father to Tommy. He looked at Emily with what seemed like sincerity in his eyes, but Emily could see through it. The manipulator was still there, hiding behind the mask. When it was Emily's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and stood up, her hands shaking slightly. She walked to the witness stand with a steady step, and as she sat down, she could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders. She was about to relive some of the darkest moments of her life, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had nothing to hide. The prosecutor asked her to recount the events of the past few years, the abuse she had endured, the broken promises, and the terror she had lived through. She spoke about the bruises, the scars, both physical and emotional. She spoke about Tommy, how Alex's violence had affected him, how she had lived in constant fear for their lives. She spoke about the moment she decided she would leave, the moment she realized she would no longer be a victim. When Emily finished speaking, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Alex's lawyer tried to counter her testimony, attempting to discredit her by suggesting she was exaggerating, that she was making things up. But Emily didn't back down. She didn't let the words of the defense affect her. She had the truth on her side. The most powerful moment came when Emily looked directly at Alex, her voice clear and unwavering. "You're not the man I married," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "And you'll never be the man I thought you were. You've destroyed everything we had. You don't get to come back into our lives, Alex. Not now. Not ever." Alex flinched, his face momentarily betraying the anger he tried to conceal. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The court had heard the truth, and they couldn't unhear it. The judge took several days to deliberate, but Emily felt in her heart that she had already won. She had spoken the truth, and nothing else mattered. When the ruling finally came, it was in her favor. Alex was granted no visitation rights, and he was ordered to undergo further psychological evaluation before he could even be considered for supervised visitation in the future. It wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for Tommy. It was the end of Alex's hold on their lives. It was the beginning of something new. The moment the ruling was read aloud, Emily felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her chest. The relief was overwhelming, almost suffocating. She could breathe again. She could finally look forward to a future without fear. As she walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit her face like a warm embrace. The world felt different, new, even. She wasn't walking in the shadow of Alex anymore. She was walking toward her future, with Tommy at her side and the love of her 3 loyal dogs surrounding her. Tommy ran to her as soon as they stepped out into the fresh air. "Mom! You did it!" His voice was full of excitement, his face beaming with the joy of knowing that their lives were about to change forever. Emily knelt down and hugged him tightly. "We did it, Tommy. We're free." Shadow, Pearl, and Rust bounded up to them, their tails wagging furiously, as if they knew that the battle had been won. They had been by her side through every step of this journey, her constant companions, her silent heroes. Emily knew that without them, without their love and loyalty, she might not have had the strength to keep fighting. As they walked back to their car, Emily looked at Tommy, at the future she was about to build for him, for herself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear, she was ready. No matter what challenges came their way, she would face them head-on. Because she had learned, through pain and perseverance, that she was stronger than she had ever known. And for the first time in a long time, Emily could finally say, without hesitation, that she was free. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.